Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Wednesday, April 8th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, federal transparency has improved on paper, but GAO says key gaps still undermine accountability and program integrity. Plus, from AI to DEI to national security, congressional oversight is widening, and more agencies are being asked to explain how decisions get made. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The General Services Administration, a former hub of activity for the Department of Government Efficiency, is looking to hire hundreds of employees after facing deep workforce cuts last year. The agency's top leader is also taking on a second job as the acting head of the National Archives and Records Administration. And for its current workforce, GSA is asking employees to provide a daily check-in on where they're working. For a look at all of this, I'm joined by Federal News Network's Jory Heckman. Jory, thanks for being here.
Hey, Terry. Great to be here.
Sounds like there's a lot going on at GSA. Let's start with hiring. Where are they hiring and what for?
Right. So GSA's Public Building Service is putting the Help Wanted sign out. They're looking to hire about 400 employees over the next 6 months. This is all according to an internal email we received. And this is an area where GSA has been hiring in the past because they went through some pretty substantial reductions in force last year, but they almost have immediately turned around and gone the opposite direction. Last fall, for example, PBS brought back 400 employees that they had previously terminated, had previously given them reduction in force notices, and they said, actually, never mind, we need to bring you guys back and put you guys back to work. One thing that the GSA really focused on at the height of DOGE activity last year was a substantial reduction of the federal building portfolio, that there was major cuts pushed to cut federal owned and leased buildings. And so there were some successful efforts to do that, but not nearly to the degree that DOGE anticipated. And so there needs to be a workforce around to manage the buildings that the GSA still owns and leases.
Does this mark a change in other sections besides PBS where it's different from how GSA operated last year?
To a much smaller degree, the Federal Acquisition Service is also in hiring mode. They are looking to bring people on board for their early career kind of pathways program. They're looking to bring on about 50 people for their latest cohort there, but also a place where GSA has also seen workforce reductions, not to the same extent as PBS, but when you look at the agency overall, when you look at where they were in October of 2024, before the Trump administration to present day, GSA has seen about a 40% reduction in its workforce. And so they are swinging the pendulum back in the other direction.
In other news, you note that the GSA administrator has been tapped to lead NARA, a position formerly held by the Secretary of State. What's going on there?
That's right. So what we've learned is that GSA Administrator Ed Forrest will be the acting head of the National Archives and Records Administration for the short term at least. There is a nominee pending before the Senate who would permanently lead NARA, but as you pointed out, Secretary of State Marco Rubio had previously been the acting head of NARA, but under the Federal Vacancies Reform Act, there was a 210-day window for him to serve in that position, and afterwards he had to step back from that role and focus on his other jobs of Secretary of State, Interim National Security Advisor, and some other projects as well. But this is now something that GSA is taking on as well, or GSA administrators going to take on. This was something that was notified to both the NARA workforce and the GSA workforce, and Forrest did tell employees that he's going to be focusing on priorities at both agencies.
Well, given all of that churn in the GSA workforce, what is GSA asking its workforce, its current workforce, to do every day?
Yeah, so this is a new development here. GSA is asking its workforce to check in daily, telling the agency where physically they're working. There's a Google form they have to fill out where they have to tell the agency whether they're working in their GSA-assigned building, whether they're working in a different building if they've been detailed to do something else somewhere else, and whether they're teleworking, whether they're on scheduled leave, a number of different checkboxes to follow here. And they are asking for this data now. This is something GSA actually had done previously but stopped doing because they were trying to automate this process. They were trying to get an automatic sense without the manual data entry of figuring out where GSA employees were working and how full GSA-owned and leased buildings are, making sure that GSA, like other agencies, were trying to adhere to a 60% minimum occupancy standard for their buildings. And so what I've heard from GSA employees is that those automation efforts weren't fully successful. They didn't work the way that GSA had anticipated. And so GSA is now back to the drawing board. They are going back to this manual data entry that they'd asked agencies to do and stopped doing about a year ago.
So is that the driving factor, the occupancy rate?
It is the occupancy rate that's a big part of it. This is a somewhat new requirement under the Use It Act. This is something that former President Joe Biden signed in the final days of his administration. It does set this 60% occupancy on average benchmark, and if agencies aren't meeting that benchmark, then they are on the hook to do something about it. And that means moving to right-size office space that they are fully occupying or close to, or co-locating with other agencies, a number of maneuvers that they can follow there. What's interesting is we actually got a closer look at the data recently, last week. In fact, GSA said that out of the nearly 10,000 buildings that it now has data on, none of them are meeting the 60% occupancy standard, and that includes GSA's own buildings. So they're trying to get those numbers up.
Is the manual process that GSA is using to collect this data similar to what other agencies are using to report that data?
You know, everywhere is different. What we've seen for some agencies is that they are relying on badge in and badge out data for especially buildings in the D.C. area. They're secure facilities. There's a turnstile you need to swipe your badge at to get into the building in the first place. And so they're just repurposing that data to get an approximation of how many employees are showing up to the building and then cross-referencing that with other data sets. But in GSA's case, they are asking employees when they log in for the day to fill out this Google form and say where they're working from, and to also give people a heads up of what days they've asked off for scheduled leave.
It seems like that circles us back to where we started this conversation with the Public Building Service. All of that occupancy data may inform their disposal plan.
That's right. Yeah, it really does go back full circle here. There's still this big push to get rid of underutilized federal buildings. There are a number of them. GSA has been leading the charge for the Trump administration of moving some agencies out of their headquarters buildings in the greater D.C. area, using this occupancy data as justification for moving them out to places that are smaller.
That's Federal News Network's Jory Heckman. Jory, thanks for this rundown.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, federal transparency has improved on paper, but GAO says key gaps still undermine accountability and program integrity. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Congress and federal agencies have taken steps to improve transparency around spending and programs, but GAO says persistent gaps continue to limit oversight, efficiency, and program integrity. From incomplete spending data to FOIA backlogs and missing program inventories, these weaknesses carry real operational consequences. To explain where transparency efforts are falling short and what would make the biggest difference, I'm joined by Jeff Arkin, Director of Strategic Issues at the Government Accountability Office. Mr. Arkin, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Terry. Pleasure to be here.
GAO recently testified before Congress that the executive branch still has some pretty significant work to do to meet the targets for transparency around information about federal spending and programs. From GAO's perspective, what really are the high-level headlines and highlights related to that testimony?
Sure. Well, I think the key point is improving the transparency of information on federal programs and spending is really key to increasing both the efficiency and effectiveness of the federal government, but also increasing the public's understanding of federal programs and how their tax dollars are spent. And while the government has made progress towards those goals, it still has some work to do, particularly in a few areas that we covered in the testimony. One is the usaspending.gov website, which is the government's official public source of federal spending data. Another area deals with information available on the magnitude of improper payments made by federal agencies. And an improper payment is one that shouldn't have been made or was made in the incorrect amount. Third, we have also found issues with what is known as the Federal Program Inventory, which is another website where the government is required to include and annually update an inventory of federal programs. And finally, we found some issues with access to federal government information through requests made under the Freedom of Information Act, which is known as, in short, by FOIA.
Those are four pretty important topics, and I know GAO has done an incredible depth of reporting and analysis on each one of them. But it is interesting to me that you tied them together in this testimony to give a pretty comprehensive perspective on government transparency. So let's take each one of them in order and start with USA spending. Agencies are legally required to report spending data on USA spending, but your work shows recurring problems with completeness and accuracy. Why is it so difficult years after those requirements were put in place to get good data on USA spending?
As you mentioned, the requirements have been in place for a while, and the government now has quite a bit of information available on USA spending, but we have found some gaps in a couple of areas that I can highlight. One is with what are known as subawards. So when an entity receives an award from the federal government, an agency like a grant, it can pass through part of that award to another agency to help carry out the work, and that pass-through award is known as a subaward. In addition to grantees being responsible for, or agencies rather, being responsible for reporting the amount of grants and who they are going to, when a grant recipient passes part of that award along, it also has to report on USA spending. And that's where we've really seen some gaps, missing information, numbers that are impossibly large, a lot of duplicate information. And part of the problem is, while the agencies are responsible for ensuring that the grant recipients, that information gets reported, it's actually the recipients who are responsible for seeing reporting, that the reporting on subawards makes it to USA spending. And the agencies don't have that direct relationship with the subawardee. And so there are some problems, I think, with agency understanding. We've made recommendations about improving guidance, and hopefully that will help address the problem.
It's not just a data management issue, because that then gets to the issue that you raised about improper payments. GAO has noted that number is almost $186 billion across 64 programs in FY25, and that figure still doesn't capture the full scope of the risk. So how does this incomplete or unreliable data limit agencies' ability to prevent and detect improper payments?
In not having complete and accurate improper payment estimates, there's a few effects of that. So without them, it's more difficult for agencies to understand what are the causes of why those improper payments occur. Is it because of fraud? Is it because there's not sufficient documentation for a payment, or some sort of administrative error? You don't know what you're dealing with until you do the work to try to estimate the extent of the problem. Another thing is, you also don't have a metric to even evaluate whether your efforts to reduce those improper payments are effective. And finally, I would say it's really important that the public has confidence in the federal government, and that the money that their taxpayers and how they're being used is being used for lawful reasons and not being made in a way that it shouldn't.
I'm speaking with Jeff Arkin. He's Director of Strategic Issues at GAO. Well, Mr. Arkin, let's take the third piece, the inventory of federal programs. We talked about this on the show actually a couple of weeks ago. But from GAO's perspective, why is a complete program inventory so foundational to transparency and accountability?
The inventory is supposed to include a couple types of information. One is just how much is being spent on a particular program. And then the other thing is, how is that program helping an agency achieve its goals, which are usually goals that Congress has put in place for the agency to achieve, to further something for the American people. Without having that inventory, it's really difficult to answer some basic questions. Simple one in terms of how many programs support a given goal, and which agencies administer them, what a program costs, and are there multiple programs delivering similar services to the same communities? That latter part is really important in terms of trying to identify programs that might overlap with other programs or may even be duplicative with other programs. And if we can identify and address those, there may be ways to reduce unnecessary costs and really facilitate service delivery to the American people.
The fourth point that you mentioned at the top was FOIA, and the testimony points to persistent FOIA backlogs across the government. The 2025 report is just out recently on FOIA backlogs, and it's a combination of both staffing reductions and increased requests that has driven the backlog up even further. So again, from GAO's perspective, what are the big issues, the main bottlenecks in the FOIA program, and what does that tell us about how agencies are managing transparency?
Well, you mentioned one key one, which is staffing. And when we talked with agencies even a couple of years ago about their efforts to address the backlog, which means there are a number of requests from Americans that are not being processed within the required timeframes, that backlog has been growing and growing, even though the government tends to respond to about 80% or plus within the required timeframes. That still leaves hundreds of thousands of requests that are not responded to in a timely way. And we've seen that there's the potential for that problem to get worse. What agencies have been reporting in their 2025 FOIA reports is further reductions in staffing and continued challenges with staffing. And so we've made some recommendations to agencies about addressing the backlog, about focusing attention and making sure that they have the staff they need to respond to requests from the public within the required timeframes.
So when we look at each one of these, spending transparency, program inventories, improper payments, and FOIA, GAO has issued numerous recommendations in each of those areas over many, many years. I have two questions here. The first is, what is the implication of all of these shortcomings for the American people? What did they not know that they should know about how their government is operating?
Yeah, I would say that on one hand, I think it's commendable that we have laws that try to increase transparency to the greatest extent possible. We have a lot of action over the years from Congress and agencies to do that, but we still don't have the complete picture. The federal government is the America's people's government. It's their tax dollars that are being spent, and they should know how much of their money is being spent and on what and who is receiving it. That's, I think, a common theme with all of these different areas that we talked about today. It's really about, one, better functioning government, but also making sure the public really understands where their tax dollars are going.
And my second question then is, with all of the recommendations on GAO's lists, whichever parts are on the high-risk list, if you could just ask agencies to do one or two things that would really help close these gaps, what would be at the top of your list?
I think, it may depend on the type of program, but certainly with improper payments, really analyzing and coming up with the estimates that, one, are required by law, but also will really help them to minimize fraud, waste and abuse. Fraud obviously being something on which there's great attention these days. It's something that we've flagged in the past. Those are hundreds of billions of dollars that could be either collected or that are being paid improperly, that could be used for something else, whether it's deficit reduction or providing services to the American people. That is an important consideration for government agencies to take.
Did you get any sense following the testimony that Congress was ready to take any action that would help address these gaps?
We have seen a number of bills that were introduced in this current Congress that touches on some of the areas that we found, and I think that's an important point in that there's responsibility for agencies, but there's also ways that Congress can address problems by changing the law, particularly if there are gaps in the law that they either prevent agencies from doing what they need to do or can facilitate them from doing that. And so I think there are some where we're hopeful that the passage of those laws will have some impact on addressing the problems.
I've been speaking with Jeff Arkin. He's Director of Strategic Issues at GAO. Thanks so much for joining me and walking us through this important discussion.
Thank you, Terry. My pleasure.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, DOGE's Medicaid data experiment adds a new player to healthcare fraud enforcement, the public. But first, from AI to DEI to national security, congressional oversight is widening and more agencies are being asked to explain how decisions get made. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Congress may be struggling to pass legislation, but it's not slowing down when it comes to oversight. Investigations in 2026 are moving faster, stretching wider, and pulling in companies, universities, and nonprofits that may not see themselves as obvious targets. Joining me to break down what's driving this moment and what smart preparation really looks like is partner at Morgan Lewis, Amanda Robinson. Ms. Robinson, it's great to have you on the show today.
Thank you, Terry. Good to be here.
Your firm has tried to forecast the expectations for congressional oversight hearings and investigations for 2026. Let's start our conversation today with the factors that might be making your crystal ball a little cloudy. What is uniquely different about the 2026 environment?
So in a midterm year, election year, essentially, congressional investigations often becomes one of the primary ways lawmakers influence the policy conversation. And that's unique to 2026 versus 2025, for example. So passing major legislation is difficult under the best of circumstances. But it becomes especially challenging when the House and Senate are closely divided, so there's slim majorities, and the legislative calendar is shortened by campaigning and district work periods. So as a result, oversight activity, hearings, investigations, letters, and committee reports often become the most visible and flexible tool Congress has to advance priorities.
Are you seeing them move in that direction so far?
Absolutely. Although it's notable, right, that in 2026, I would say the biggest issue is continuity. Many investigations currently underway are not brand new initiatives. Instead, they build on multi-year investigatory records that committees have already developed. This is particularly true in areas such as healthcare, pricing, technology platforms, national security issues involving, for example, China, and workplace practices. Because committees have already gathered documents and held hearings on these topics, it's relatively easy for them to continue oversight without starting from scratch. But again, here in this midterm election year, we're seeing members highlight issues that really resonate with voters to apply pressure to regulators or private actors and shape policy debates.
Are you sensing that the hearings that are being held now and the investigations that are underway are really about fact-finding, or sometimes there's a sense that these are just really about headline generation?
Both, honestly, and it depends on the topic, but the political environment certainly shapes how investigations unfold. In an election year, oversight is often designed not only to gather information, as you've said, but also really what I'd call to create public accountability. Here, high-profile hearings, especially those involving corporate executives or government officials, can generate significant media attention and help frame policy debates heading into the election season.
So for agencies that get pulled into oversight hearings, adjacent companies, certainly universities and other nonprofits are getting pulled in. What is the practical risk profile that you're seeing for these organizations right now as a result of congressional oversight?
Yeah, that's a good question. When people think about congressional investigations, they often picture subpoenas or dramatic hearings on Capitol Hill. But in reality, most investigations begin much earlier and much more quietly. Typically, the first step is a committee letter requesting documents, data, and explanations of specific corporate or institutional practices. Now, these letters can request a wide range of materials, internal emails, policy documents, compliance materials, or data related to pricing or business practices. Now, while these requests are technically voluntary, organizations often treat them seriously because they signal that the committee is building an investigatory record. So that's really the sort of initial focus or initial actions that Congress will take. Of course, after receiving documents, committees frequently conduct staff briefings or transcribed interviews. Now, these sessions allow committee staff to ask detailed questions and clarify issues before deciding whether a public hearing is necessary. And in many investigations, the majority of fact-finding occurs at this stage. Public hearings are typically used much more strategically.
Your report also notes that many of these investigations are falling under a framework or an umbrella of national security. How is that umbrella allowing congressional investigators to bring in all kinds of different focus areas?
Yeah, so you're exactly right. National security framing is a huge trend that we're seeing in congressional investigations. Now, traditionally, national security oversight focused on defense contractors, intelligence agencies, and military programs. Now, today, however, congressional committees increasingly apply a national security lens to a much broader range of industries. That would be supply chains, technology infrastructure, semiconductor manufacturing, data governance, and academic partnerships. They're all being investigated and examined through the lens of a strategic competition, particularly with China. Now, this shift reflects a growing bipartisan consensus in Washington that economic and technological capabilities are central to geopolitical competition. As a result, companies that operate in sectors such as advanced technology, biotech, telecom, or critical minerals may find themselves drawn into congressional investigations even if they have never previously interacted with national security regulators.
I'm speaking with Amanda Robinson. She's a partner at Morgan Lewis. Amanda, you talk about national security being a very common through line. It seems like one of the other very common through lines is artificial intelligence. You can't have a hearing on the Hill on any topic that doesn't somehow include AI. What line of questioning there should organizations be ready for?
AI, that's the topic du jour. So one issue that has received particular attention in the AI context is algorithmic pricing, the use of software systems to analyze market data and recommend or automatically adjust prices. Now, litigation involving a property management software company, for example, has drawn significant attention in Washington. Plaintiffs have alleged that the software's pricing recommendations may facilitate what they call coordination among landlords, raising antitrust concerns. These allegations have prompted hearings and broader discussions about whether algorithms that rely on shared market data could enable anti-competitive conduct. Congress has also considered legislation addressing this issue. One example is the Preventing Algorithmic Collusion Act, which has been introduced but has not advanced to enactment. Now, beyond competition concerns, lawmakers are increasingly interested in internal AI governance. Committees frequently ask companies questions such as, who approves the deployment of AI systems? What safeguards exist to detect bias or unintended consequences? What oversight mechanisms exist within the company?
Amanda, your analysis flags that DEI issues continue to be a focus for congressional oversight. When they request internal training materials or communications, what are they really looking for and how should organizations prepare?
You're exactly right, Terry. DEI remains one of the most politically contested areas of congressional oversight. Republican-led committees in the House have conducted investigations into DEI programs at universities, nonprofit organizations, and entities that receive, for example, federal funding. These inquiries often focus on hiring practices, internal training programs, communications about diversity initiatives, and metrics used to track diversity goals. Investigators frequently request these internal documents, those that you cited, including these training materials, for example. And what they're really examining, for example, is whether federal funding supports programs that they argue may conflict with civil rights laws. At the same time, congressional oversight in this area is occurring alongside broader developments in the courts and executive branch. The Supreme Court's 2023 decision in Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard held that race-based affirmative action in university admissions violated the Equal Protection Clause. Although the case addressed higher education admissions specifically, it has prompted broader debates about how similar legal reasoning might apply to corporate and employment programs. As a result, congressional oversight operates as part of a broader policy feedback loop. Congressional investigations can highlight issues that regulators or private litigants later pursue, and developments in litigation can in turn prompt further congressional scrutiny.
So let's turn back to where we started. 2026 is an unusual year. It's a midterm election year. Lots of folks trying to make a name for themselves as they prepare for their election campaigns. If you're an agency, staff member, or a company that gets called by a committee, what's your best mode of preparation?
Yeah, so for organizations that may interact with Congress, the key takeaway is that congressional investigations should be viewed not only as a legal issue, but also as a strategic and reputational risk management challenge. Organizations should assess where their operations intersect with current oversight priorities. Areas drawing, as we talked about, particular attention in Congress include AI, governance, DEI policies, workplace practices, healthcare pricing, supply chains, and of course, national security. Organizations should ensure that internal documentation aligns with their public statements. Congressional investigations frequently request in these internal communications, compliance materials, and training documents. And then when those materials contradict public messaging, it can quickly become a focal point of an investigation. Companies should recognize that congressional oversight rarely occurs in isolation. Investigations by Congress often overlap with regulatory enforcement actions and private litigation. For example, a congressional inquiry into pricing practices could occur at the same time that regulators are investigating similar issues or private litigants are filing lawsuits. Now, because of this overlap, organizations often benefit from a coordinated response strategy that includes legal counsel, compliance professionals, a government affairs team, and communication specialists.
I've been speaking with Amanda Robinson. She's a partner at Morgan Lewis. Really appreciate that very practical advice. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, DOGE's Medicaid data experiment adds a new player to healthcare fraud enforcement, the public. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. By releasing a sweeping Medicaid claims data set, DOGE is testing whether broader public analysis can complement government fraud investigations. The move raises questions about accuracy, accountability, and whether this approach is scalable or sustainable. I'll walk through the pros and cons with John Barry, Senior Counsel at Epstein Becker Green. Mr. Barry, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
You've done some looking into a data set that the DOGE team inside the Health and Human Services Agency released. It described it as the largest Medicaid data set in department history. From your legal perspective, what was different about this release compared to prior transparency or fraud prevention efforts?
Sure. Well, there's a couple things. This is the first time that the Department of Health and Human Services has ever released provider-level Medicaid data to the public. Previously, there were very limited ways to access Medicaid provider-level data, meaning data that you could look at specific providers and what they were billing. But that was required often institutional access and cost money. This is the first time that this has ever been available to the public, and specifically a data set released to the public for the public to look at and try to find issues on their own.
So this is a bit like crowdsourcing research. That's
right. There have been some cuts at the federal level to the Department of Justice during Trump's administration. Some estimates have it upwards of 4,000 or 5,000 jobs. And that seems, antithetical to the government's push to rout out fraud at the federal level. And so it's interestingly enough, to a certain extent, the government has said, you know what, we have less people in the Department of Justice, but we do have a lot of people, and this is the people's money. I think the message from the Trump administration has been, this is not the government's money that's being potentially misused or stolen. This is your money. This is the taxpayers' money. And so you, the taxpayers, have an incentive to look into this on your own. And there's been some very public cases, particularly in Minnesota and California, that have been highlighted by Trump and J.D. Vance, and to a certain extent, the Department of Treasury, that have kind of given the federal government some backing to say, hey, you individual person can really make a difference and help rout out potentially billions of dollars of fraud. And we want you to do that.
The federal and state agencies already have specialized fraud units to identify improper billing. How does opening this kind of data to the public change that fraud detection model, and what risks might it introduce?
You know, that's an interesting question. I think that this data set presents opportunities and, as you mentioned, significant risks. The opportunities are that you have, private, what I'll call sleuths, or even data scientists, particularly with the advent of AI and data analytics and the access that individuals have to that you almost kind of make it a little bit of a game for these people to try to rout out fraud and find and share that with the public. The issue is that data on its own is a starting point. It is not the end point. It does not tell you the whole story. And I think that there is a risk that certain people publicizing data that they may have found and think that it is clearly fraud may really not be fraud at the end of the day. And when you have the Department of Justice and the OIG within the Health and Human Services and the FBI and the Financial Crimes Network within the Department of Treasury, those people live and breathe that and are more specialized and have training on kind of really knowing where to spend their time and what to do with data. And so the risk is that there could be some wild goose chases going on, and particularly when it's referred from the public to the state and federal agencies, that you do have that risk that maybe some institutions, even just reputational damage from being publicized on social media networks, that, hey, this provider seems to have increased their billing 50% over the last 4 years. Well, that alone is not indicative of fraud. And I think there is a significant risk that people may be getting a bit ahead of themselves in calling something fraud when it isn't.
I'm speaking with John Barry. He's senior counsel at Epstein Becker Green. Let's pull on that thread a little bit, because the False Claim Act is invoked here, and whistleblower incentives to try to get people to make those claims and also perhaps charge providers under the False Claims Act. How is all of that coming together with a consideration of due process?
So, as we had discussed, there is always the chance for reputational damage. But with respect to due process, even a qui tam action, which is a claim brought in the name of the federal government, but by a private actor, alleging that fraud was perpetrated on the federal government. And in those actions, the individual bringing the claim, which is called a relator, has the ability to potentially get part of the settlement if fraud is ultimately found. That does not ultimately do away with the due process requirements of the legal system. There's still an accusation. Unfortunately, in our legal system, sometimes when accusations get out there in the public space, that is almost as bad as being convicted. But in the court system, an accusation alone does not mean that somebody is going to be convicted. And bringing a qui tam case alone on your own, particularly when the way that most qui tam cases go is that an individual relator will bring a case to the government and say, hey, I think there is fraud. I have this special information. I'm going to bring this case. Would you like to participate with me? And often in the strongest cases, the federal government will participate with them. If the federal government does not participate, it often means that the federal government has decided there is not a strong case here or there is not fraud. And so often those cases will be ultimately thrown out of court by the judicial system saying, well, the federal government didn't find anything. We, the court, are going to look at it. Did you meet the requirements to really bring a claim here? So to clarify, the due process requirements are still there with the Qui Tam case, but you are right that once you bring a claim and once negative publicity gets out about a provider, that is hard to kind of undo that reputational damage.
I want to explore another angle here. The president has stood up an anti-fraud task force. It's being led by the vice president. Do you think, or do you see a way where this DOGE HHS data set might be useful and informative in that task force's efforts? They're starting with benefits. Medicaid is a great place to start, I suppose.
That's right. Medicare and Medicaid spending and combined is the largest portion of the annual federal government spending. Those two buckets together account for 27% of annual spending. And so where there is a significant amount of government spending, there will be a significant amount of bad actors trying to perpetrate fraud to get some of those funds. And the Trump administration has been trying to attack fraud in the healthcare space from as many angles as it can. Not only is it tried to crowdsource this through releasing this HHS Medicaid data, they separately have a whistleblower website set up through the Department of Treasury to specifically incentivize people with financial benefits to report fraud that may be tied to healthcare, but specifically money flowing through banks that would be in the purview of the Department of Treasury. There's also, in addition to the new task force that was just recently announced, in 2025, there were these healthcare fraud data fusion centers that were multi-agency task forces made up from the members of the Department of Justice, Health and Human Services, the FBI, to try to gather resources from various government agencies to rout out fraud. So this is all a way of saying the release of this DOGE HHS data set absolutely aligns with the government's continued push for almost seemingly every month. There is a new task force or a new release of information. For example, on March 30th, the Department of the Treasury, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, put out a financial crimes enforcement bulletin specifically about healthcare fraud and what banks should do, the types of suspicious activity that banks should look for, specifically related to healthcare fraud. So the government is trying to attack this from every angle, and it's really, it makes sense because of how large the spending is for Medicare and Medicaid.
So does this mark then sort of a new front in the anti-fraud war? And might we be expecting to see more data set releases, perhaps around student loans or grant recipients or Social Security payments?
That's a very interesting question. And I think what you see here is this data set is focused on provider fraud. But we may see a movement towards data sets, and this would be very controversial, towards individual or beneficiary fraud. Now, the Big Beautiful Bill tries to get out Medicaid fraud from a different angle, from the beneficiary angle. And that the way that the Trump administration is trying to rout out beneficiary fraud is trying to limit the ways in which people may enroll or continue to be enrolled in the Medicaid ranks. For example, there's the work for Medicaid that someone has to either prove that they've been working or going to job training or school for X amount of hours per month. And this is all a way of trying to cut down in any way possible on spending in the healthcare realm. And I think it's too early to say whether the government would release specific data sets on individuals related to, for example, federal loans. But, even before this HHS data set, this is not the first time that the government has made publicly available information about a government program. For example, one of the largest COVID era spending programs was the Paycheck Protection Program, which were loans to small businesses and then eventually to even single independent contractors to try to keep those businesses afloat during COVID. Eventually, every single individual or small business that took a PPP loan, that information was released by the federal government. And even before this HHS data set, people were looking at that Paycheck Protection Program data set to see, hey, should this business really have gotten this loan? That was not publicized. The release of that data set was not publicized in the crowdsourcing way that this HHS data set was. But this is not the first time that this type of crowdsourcing has ultimately come about through release of federal data sets.
Coming back to the HHS data, if you're a provider, what should you be thinking about right now, both for protecting your own reputation and making sure that your data is correct?
Sure. Well, number one, I would try to take a look at that data set to see whether if you are a Medicaid provider, how your information has ultimately been relayed through this data set. One issue is this Medicaid data is coming from the 50 states separately, in addition to certain territories such as Puerto Rico. And so there is always going to be differences in the way that the states report the information. If I were a provider, I would want to look to make sure that the information released publicly at least generally aligns with what I believe that I am billing for, that the state that I'm in or the states that I'm in are reporting that information accurately. And second, regardless of whether the information is found in the HHS data set or not, providers should always be ensuring that they have a billing and coding compliance program, that they are accurately and properly billing only for the services that they provide.
I've been speaking with John Barry. He's Senior Counsel at Epstein Becker Green. Thank you so much for joining me today.
It was a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Defense Department is once again facing scrutiny over how it handles sensitive but unclassified information after a new watchdog review found that widespread problems identified years ago remain unresolved. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis is here with more detail. Anastasia, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Terry.
Tell us about this latest review and what the Inspector General found.
Yes, so last year, the IG was looking into something completely different. At the time, they were reviewing Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's use of Signal, the commercial messaging app, to discuss operational details of airstrikes in Yemen. So that is when they identified broader concerns related to how the Defense Department marks controlled unclassified information, or CUI. The issue was most likely so widespread that they felt the need to issue this management advisory. Management advisories are usually for letting organizations know that an urgent issue was found during a review. And these management advisories give organizations to kind of fix the problems before someone requests a full-on audit. In terms of what the IG found was that DoD organizations often didn't mark CUI documents properly. So CUI documents often did not have the required designation indicator block, the block that includes the CUI category and the originating DOD component or office. And what the IG found was that when they did have it, the organizations often defaulted to restrictive dissemination controls, such as federal employees and contractors only, rather than not using limited dissemination controls at all.
So this is not a new problem, right? Back in 2023, the DoD IG conducted an audit of the department's CUI program. What did they find back then?
Yeah, so just a little bit of background. The CUI program was established in 2010, but the Defense Department implemented the program in 2020. So in 2023, the IG had a full audit of the CUI program. The Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security, which oversees the CUI program, they collect and publish their own data on the error rate of CUI markings. And in 2023, the office said that based on their internal review of over 48,000 documents in 2023 and 26,000 documents in 2024, the components reported that only 9% of the documents in 2023 and 11% of the documents in 2024 did not have that CUI designation indicator block. But during the audit in 2023, the IG office said the problem is way more pervasive than that. According to their non-statistical sample of 300 documents, they found that almost 50% of the documents did not have that designation indicator block. They also looked at 40 different types of documents. They describe it from the same originator supporting the same operation. And they found that 70% of those documents were either not marked at all, or they were marked with legacy markings, such as for official use only. So that's something that we don't use anymore. And at the same time, the documents that were properly marked were over-restrictive.
Anastasia, what's causing these ongoing problems? What is the root?
Yeah, so there are a couple of problems, but the IG talks about the office having conflicting and insufficient guidance and training, and then a lack of enforcement that causes personnel to default to restrictive markings, or it causes them to default to avoiding marking documents altogether. So back in 2023, the IG office issued 14 recommendations. 6 still remain open. And now in this 2026 advisory, the AG had 5 recommendations. I think they went back to 2023, saw the recommendations from that audit, realized that a lot of those issues were unaddressed, and then they addressed it in the 2026 advisory. So far, the Intelligence and Security Office already updated the conflicting information found in their frequently asked questions training aid on their website, but recommendations to revise guidance and training documents to clarify the implications of using limited dissemination controls, that recommendation remains open.
How consequential is it when documents are improperly marked? Either they should be CUI and they're not marked, or they shouldn't be and they are marked.
Yeah, so if it's too restrictive, the Defense Department cannot share information with Congress or other agencies. If it's improperly marked, it costs money for industry because industry has to decide whether they should incur additional costs outside the scope of the contract, or they should risk a security incident. Those are the options that they have. I spoke to Bill Greenwald, who's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He took it a step further, and he said that this is already costing the government and industry billions of dollars to comply with the program just through the CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification process. And, there have been very little to no debate on the effects of CUI. And also, he said that this proliferation of markings such as Fed only it's just a new way for the Defense Department to keep Congress and the public in the dark.
Anastasia, the marking of documents really has humans at the center of it. And you mentioned the problem with training and guidance with all of the churn in the Defense Department's workforce over the last year. How are they going to keep people trained and up to speed on the new guidance if they're trying to address the problem?
I think they first need to start with updating that guidance because, like the IG found, there's a lot of inconsistencies and conflicting information within the guidance. And the workforce, they do their best.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. Anastasia, thanks for bringing us this story.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find the full details at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.